Hello and welcome to ICA in Conversation that broadcasts twice a month, focusing on current issues and challenges in the context of counter-financial crime. I'm Tim Tyler, and coming up we're going to consider human trafficking, the buoyant, profitable trade in human beings, and in particular how it's evolving and our role in combating it. To do this, I'm joined by Neil Giles, the president of the Traffic Analysis Hub and Global Intelligence Ambassador for Stop the Traffic. Neil has a long history countering human trafficking, and before this, in UK law enforcement, countering global organised crime within New Scotland Yard, the National Crime Squad, the Serious Organised Crime Agency. Hello, Neil, and thank you for joining us, or joining me for this conversation.
It's a pleasure. I'd probably do anything for you, Tim.
I was expecting that. Thank you, Neil. So we're going to follow the usual format for this conversation. 20 minutes where Neil and I are going to explore some of the key issues. But the last 10 minutes will respond to any questions or observations that you may have. So please add your thoughts. I've got LinkedIn in front of me. If you use the comments section within LinkedIn, you can add any questions, observations, or thoughts that you might have so that we can make this interactive and not just about a single conversation. That said, let's make a start. And Neil, can I invite you perhaps to set the scene by just for a moment considering just how much of a threat, how much of a problem is human trafficking today?
So to put it in context, the more you look, the more you learn, and the more you find, of course. And so when I first became interested in this topic, it took a while before UK government began to sort of suggest that something like 10 to 13,000 people might be affected by what we call modern slavery in the United Kingdom. I think we openly recognise that's probably north of 150,000. And whilst the numbers have got larger, I think it's just that we're looking more effectively than we used to. And all of the other numbers have grown alongside it. Globally, this is affecting 50 million people. And it generates about $500 billion a year in revenue.
Yeah.
And essentially, most human trafficking enterprises present in our systems as small businesses, as SMEs. And the whole thing essentially is a sub-economy. It's an errant economy that lives like a cuckoo in the world that we interact with every day. Specializes in some particular areas more than others, but is very adept at building relationships with all the relevant elements that it requires to. It needs a financial services relationship or more than one financial services relationship. And it needs to operate effectively to generate demand for the products and services of the people they have in exploitation. Essentially, there's no point in recruiting and trafficking anyone, whether it's 50 yards or across 5 borders, unless you've got somewhere to deploy them and earn money from them, because you've got to feed them, transport them, etc. That they bring a cost with them.
There's so much in there that I'd like to pick up on, but if I understand you correctly, you're saying that this activity very often hides in plain sight. And part of the challenge that we face is seeing things for what they are, identifying potential human trafficking based on what we can see in front of us. Can I just for a moment just go back to that number of 50 million people? It's so many, it's almost difficult to, well, it is difficult to relate to that. I mean, was it Stalin who said, one person's death is a tragedy, but 1,000 people is a statistic, and there's a danger, isn't there? I think that we treat this as a statistic, but that's 50 million people that are either being in forced labor of some kind. There's, of course, organ harvesting as an element of this, and forced prostitution as an element of this. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think it is. Um, uh, you know, my journey with this began while I was still serving in the national agency, and I bumped into Stop the Traffic, who were talking about this issue in about 2006, 2007, and I frankly didn't recognise it in the way it was being portrayed. And I've been in law enforcement for well over 30 years at that point, and I was moderately alive, I thought, to how organised crime affected the world in which I operated.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and so my first thought was, how do we draw on this experience as a law enforcement entity, the not-for-profit world's interaction with survivors? How can we draw on that to be more effective as an investigative and prosecuting entity? Um, uh, and and to a degree was successful in that. It was only when I went to visit Southwest Asia about 3 or 4 years later, took some time out, went with them, spent some time with survivors in rehabilitation, and learned two very scary things. Number one, that the problem was way too big for the justice process around the world to cope with. And as soon as you say 50 million, Jim, I mean, we all recognise that we need to think about this in a different way to simply hoping that arrest and prosecution will solve it. And secondly, that those survivor narratives, that lived experience, if you could capture it effectively in sufficient quantity, it would begin to paint rich pictures for actors in every walk of life, that could begin to consume those without it taking a huge amount of additional resource, and begin to change the accepting environment for a less accepting environment for the products and services of people in exploitation.
So you've picked up on something there, which I think is really important. Um, you touched on the fact that we can't use simple criminal justice solutions alone in order to solve this problem. That it needs, if you like, a cross-sector, a wider response. I'd like to unpack that a little more, if I may, but we'll come back to it in a few minutes' time. But because before we do that, I'd just like to better understand what it looks like in today's world. So we've touched on the scale of it and the nature of it in broad terms, but what does it look and feel like? What's going on around us and around the world in this context?
Okay, so some sectors in some geographies are particularly vulnerable to human trafficking. And the rule of thumb is, if you need labour bulges at any particular point in time, and look to third party providers, that's a wonderful opportunity for traffickers to infiltrate the process, and effectively steal the wages of those concerned. Great examples. Most recently, I'll take a US example. Um, the biggest sanitation delivery company, the kind of people that would arrive at a huge meat processing factory or chicken processing plant after hours to clean the machinery down, sanitize the place ready for work to begin early the next day. We're bringing in busloads of children to do that work, and effectively just stealing all the money. So there's a profit margin clue here. One of my current conversation pieces with businesses, particularly when you're looking at numbers. A company that's making a profit margin that doesn't fit with the norm, within reasonable balance of the norms, in a vulnerable sector, is one that needs auditing. It's all that's probably oversimplifying the issue, but it is a truism.
Yeah.
Margins are clues.
So in this instance, the cost of the people to undertake the activity. And another example might be fruit picking. I guess it's very seasonal.
100%.
The cost of the people to do this, if it's significantly lower than you would expect, there could be a clue. But there's a question contained in this, and that is, how do they get away with it? Because this is hardly hidden. It goes back to what we were saying, hidden in plain sight. Why isn't it that the people don't complain? Don't say, well, hang on, I should be paid more.
Well, the victims don't complain more often than not because they are subject to a range of coercive
Okay.
actions. That's everything from debt bondage. Traffickers tend to recruit where they're strong. So they will recruit from communities that they have lasting influence in. And another example for you, I'm going to talk about Romania, southeast Romania,
Yeah.
and a true story. A young woman was recruited from her home in southeast Romania, brought to Ireland, was then subjected to pressure to sell sex, revolted against that pressure. And by the time she got up enough courage to ring home and say, Mum and Dad, you need to help me to come home, the bad guys had already been to see her parents, and said, your daughter is in Ireland and she owes us a lot of money and she's refusing to work. So I'm afraid you're going to have to pay Mum and Dad, and it's this much money. And for a poor family in southeast Romania, that's an extraordinarily scary prospect.
Yes.
And so when the child rings and says, help me get out of this, please help me get out of this, they say, you need to work your debt off. You know, they've been to see us. It's that kind of disgusting, frankly,
Yes.
control that's in place. Flip it to the other side.
Yeah.
Traffickers are really adept at creating relationships with elements of our business world that are important to them. Financial institutions being just one. I remember some years ago now giving a talk to the entire retail staff of a high street bank. Had the princely sum of 15 minutes to do that first thing in the morning, and talking them through how trafficking might present at their counter. And immediately after my presentation, one of the staff came up to me and said, there's a chap from the Baltics who runs a couple of 3 car washes around here, and he has an account with us, and he brings in 2 carrier bags full of cash every week, and we help him count it, put it into his account for him. And I said, okay, that doesn't mean that this is someone who's engaged in human trafficking, of course. What does the payroll look like on that bank account? And she thought for a minute and said, oh, there's no payroll.
Yeah.
So I said, well, perhaps you might want to look a little more deeply into that particular relationship. But essentially, the import I took from it was he was a really nice guy, treated them all beautifully, probably bought chocolates in at Christmas, and had wormed his way into their confidence.
Yes.
It's a classic.
Yes, it is. I can see that. And of course, contained in what you said is a question, well, how does human trafficking present to, for instance, someone working within financial services? So in those 15 minutes, what were you able to describe?
So red flags I've
Yes.
discovered are have the potential to drown the environment that we're trying to sensitize. Um, so communicating red flags in a way that enables rather than drowns, I think is really important. And 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 the more I've involved myself in the concept of developing consumable clues for the finance world, the more I've realized that a combination of red flags is really important. One red flags is a route to lunacy and false positives.
Yeah.
Um, and and so we've tried to build persona based red flag scenarios. So if you're a Brazilian trafficker working in London with 5 women that you've brought in from Brazil to sell sex, and that's a very current situation. South American women are very largely currently being shipped into Europe and the UK for commercial sexual exploitation. So the profile that you're going to see that needs to interest you is an unnecessary amount of car parking fees at Heathrow Airport or similar. Um, Other expenditure that you would see there, you would see extraordinary quantities of payments to Deliveroo, Just Eat. You would see unusual profiles of temporary accommodation. So moving fairly frequently, but Airbnb, booking.com, accommodation charges, you would see frequent flights. You would see money deposits because cash is still a thing. You would probably see in this day and age some investment in cryptocurrency. You would probably see small patterns of payments back to South America, together with some more significant ones. For example, and we try to build that persona-based suite that might help you identify someone who is involved in commercial sexual exploitation with South American women.
And that's quite compelling, isn't it? Because as human beings, we can relate to stories. We can relate to human beings perhaps better than to concepts or ideas. So you're giving that substance. And I guess there are other examples. Say the victim profile is going to be potentially quite different. Well, it's going to be different. It's something that we use in one of our immersive scenarios where a human trafficking victim is the customer of a bank. And the type of red flags that gave rise to were quite similar to what you set out, but it was overlaid with an element of coercion around the way in which the bank account was set up, the fact that she didn't have access to her passport, those sorts of things that, again, you can create a persona around. So that makes really good sense.
Perfectly true.
So can I just pause for a moment? I'm really keen, or we're really keen, to hear any comments or questions that anyone that's joining us, wherever you are in the world, that you might have. I'm updating my feed from LinkedIn, so I hope to see them. So please post any thoughts or questions that you might have. But in the meantime, Neil, can I go back to what we were talking about before, when we were talking about the need to find a solution to this problem other than necessarily relying on criminal justice outcomes? And of course, that's a theme that doesn't just apply to human trafficking. There's a wider issue here around organised crime. I mean, there's an estimate of, I think, about 40,000 individuals working within organised crime just within the UK, and you can multiply that as you go around the world. And we know that there just aren't enough places in prison, isn't enough space in the courts to simply prosecute our way through this. So that's a bit of a paradigm shift over the last 20 or so years. I think that's fair. But what do we mean by that? And what does it mean in the context of human trafficking?
Well, I think it's important for the world of business broadly to recognize that trafficking is a business model in its own right. and it stands principally on three pillars. It needs to be able to access and move money. So access to financial systems is essential. Um, and secondly, it needs to be able to access a demand equation. Now, that's probably everything from local cash-based work, garden clearances and small construction projects, through to the gang of construction workers that show up on a Saturday at 12 o'clock at a large site and work through the weekend, without necessarily the same kind of safety equipment you might have seen for the rest of the week. Um, it's it's the 20 caravans in a field of 100 caravans that are a little bit apart from the rest, where there are 5 or 6 people to a caravan, and they're essentially subsisting, rather than working for an income. They don't speak the language. There's always an intermediary between them, and the opportunities are still too broad for them. Um, and that won't necessarily change until more transparency arrives in the world, and that's why we're so much further forward today than we were 5 years ago.
Yes.
Transparency is coming at an exponential rate, and it's a little bit like a train. Um, uh, uh, Businesses need to work out the most propitious time to clamber aboard the train, that otherwise will hurt them very badly. And there are so many examples. I
Yes.
talked about Packers Sanitation in the States. The fines those guys are paying are extraordinary. So the money that they were making nicely using slave labor has just like vanished into thin air, and they're hurting badly. And that affects everybody all the way up to the biggies. Unilever and Procter and Gamble had to spend zillions remediating problems in their palm oil supply chain from Malaysia in the last 3 or 4 years. Reputationally and financially,
Yeah.
this is not going to be sustainable.
And of course, we know that within the EU, for instance, and Germany, I think, was a forerunner of this through the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. That's now enshrined within law. It's a requirement, not just to look at the supply chain for sustainability, environmental issues, but actually to also look for human trafficking within that.
It's about fair work. Yeah,
Fair
absolutely.
work, yes, that's helpful.
No, absolutely. All of these, issues will take time to begin to really generate change, but it's just an
Yeah,
increasing pressure on businesses to just ask smarter questions. That really
yes.
is all it is.
And we can track this, can't we, over, as you say, over a number of years. Maybe 20 years ago, it was kind of socially okay to employ people, maybe not overtly, who'd been human trafficked or who were effectively slaves, but to employ people who didn't have the right papers, the right permissions, and so on. And there's a very close relationship between the two. Now, of course, that's changing. And that goes to what you're saying around the tide that's turning around this. But can I go back for a moment? You said that there's a business model with three elements. Access to money was one element. Access to demand and to a requirement is the second. Did I miss the third along the way?
Yeah, that's the recruitment one.
It's the recruitment one. Okay.
It's where and how you recruit. So
Okay.
and you recruit where you're strong, so that you can manage the backfield. There's a 20% churn overall each year. That's a lot of people. Um, that's a recruiting requirement in excess of, well, probably around 10 million each year.
20% churn.
Yeah, so 20%, one in five falls out of trafficking and
Okay.
exploitation each year, um, and needs replacing.
So, and that's, of course, from the business perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really helpful. So I'm looking at some comments that have been made, and if I may, I'm just going to highlight them. And Anderson, you've said that compliance professionals must disrupt illicit finances, secure supply chains, and raise awareness. Is that a good description? It feels very accurate to me, Neil. Can you amplify that?
Yeah, it's quite broad based, of course. I said a couple of minutes ago that we just, to a degree, need to ask smarter questions.
Yeah.
But the key is to ask the question in the first place. I have a son who runs a small business. And a couple of years ago, his bank reached out to him and asked a couple of questions about one of the payments into his bank account. You'd be surprised how much concern that generated in him. That sort of that sort of activity is important. Um, it was mistargeted on this particular occasion, but when you start to target the right people with the right kind of questions and
Yeah.
questions, that's where lived experience comes in. It can really help you tailor the questions that you ask um, particular groups of people, and that makes a difference.
And something else that someone has commented, Camrul, thank you for your thoughts on this. And you've said, well, of course, awareness makes a difference here. It helps to mitigate the offences. And of course, that awareness can drive and be driven by the right questions. And as you say, some of that is just about lived experience. It's maybe common sense. It's intuitively knowing and feeling there's something that doesn't really add up here. Um,
There's a, a it's not a new concept, but the public-private partnership
well,
um, discussion is very much alive. The piece that concerns me is that still too many in business or government entities or law enforcement consider public-private partnership to be an exclusive relationship between law enforcement and the finance sector or similar. Uh, I think that public-private partnership needs to access voices from the not-for-profit world as well, and those that do will make progress faster.
so for those that aren't familiar with public-private partnerships, these are, of course, growing, and there are more and more countries subscribing to this model that brings together public authorities, law enforcement, and the like, national agencies, together with financial services or other typically regulated activities, in order to pool intelligence within certain constraints. And of course, within the UK, we have the
Jim,
joint GIMLET is the Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force, and that, of course, it extends to include human trafficking, and there are equivalent initiatives around much of the world. So your point, Neil, here is that having not just, if you like, the public, the government agencies, and the private present, but actually having an NGO influence within this can add value to it. Is that something you're doing? Are you active within the GIMLET?
um, we're to a degree,
To a degree,
um,
okay.
uh, and as all these things, not that Rome wasn't built in a day. So you have to keep showing up, Tim, and making a nuisance of yourself if you possibly can, in a constructive fashion.
Yeah, of course.
Um,
Of course.
and that's what we're about. Um, uh, uh, at the end of the day, that the lived experience that we've got access to has utility for both business and law enforcement, um, and and the trick for us is to be able to share it in a way that's helpful, rather in a way that is aggravating. Um, and our relationship portfolio is continuing to grow.
That's fascinating. And it links, I think, to what you were saying before about the danger that we drown in red flags, in requirements. So we need to be quite discerning, um, whether it's in combinations of red flags or discerning in terms of how we engage with law enforcement or private sector to ensure best value from that. We're coming towards the end of our 30 minutes, Neil. I'm just going to very briefly summarize some of the key things that we've talked about. And then I'd like to invite you just to close with any particular thoughts that you'd like to share, any headline issues before we draw this to a close. But just to summarize what we've covered, of course, we recognize the sheer scale and the harm that this causes. And you've given some quite poignant examples of human trafficking activity and the suffering that that's given rise to. We've talked about indicators of human trafficking and the importance of our simply using our common sense, of being aware of what's going on around us. And yes, we can recognize formally there's a range of different risk indicators that we can draw on, but that needs to be overlaid with an awareness, common sense, and a willingness to ask questions, the right questions at the right time. You've touched on your use of personas, which I think is really clever, as a way of highlighting the nature of the threat and the sorts of things that we can look for within not just regulated sectors, but within all our business and public activity. You've touched on the business model used by human traffickers that need access to funds. And it's interesting just on this, when we look at your website, the Stop the Traffic website, front and center is reference to the fact that human traffickers are dependent on financial services. So this, of course, is not only an opportunity for them, but it's also a vulnerability to them if we can show an awareness in how it's being used. That's one element of the business model. The second is around access to demand and marketplace, and the third is the opportunity to recruit. So I hope that starts to capture some of those areas that we've talked about. But Neil, can I, as we draw this to a close, anything further that you'd like to share?
I'd just like to say that this is a marathon, not a sprint, and we recognise that. But there's an awareness element to this that you could draw on very easily. So I would just encourage you to encourage those in your workplace and those that you work with and for to take a more active interest in this, because there is progress that you can make. And reputationally, one quick example, we work with one bank who we actively share intelligence with and run training programs like this with. And at the end of one of those programs, the feedback we got from one individual was, I've been working for a bank for a long time. This is actually the first time I've been really proud to work for this bank.
Can't argue with that. That's really powerful. Thank you, Neil.
My pleasure.
And thank you, wherever you're joining us from, wherever you are in the world. We will go again in conversation in 2 weeks' time. And I'll be having a conversation with Andrea Bonin-Blanc, who's working in the context of compliance around artificial intelligence. And we'll be talking about how the compliance function can support businesses as they roll out AI solutions. For the moment, though, thank you for joining us today. And Neil, thank you again for the insights that you've shared. I look forward to further conversations with you and your colleagues from Stop the Traffic around this threat and how we can work together to counter it.
Yeah, thank you for the partnership, Tim.